So I've successfully formatted my SD card and installed on it an operating system for the Raspberry Pi. I've then inserted the SD card into my Raspberry Pi and hooked up my Raspberry Pi via an HDMI cable to a screen of some sort. In this instance, I'm using a TV. I then plugged in power to my Raspberry Pi and booted it up. Okay, that's cool. But let's assume that I don't have a keyboard or a mouse. So does that mean that I can't use my Raspberry Pi? Although I would suggest that you do buy a keyboard and a mouse, you don't necessarily need one because we are able to create a secure connection through the internet to our Raspberry Pi using something known as SSH or secure shell. But before we go into how we connect to the Raspberry Pi with secure shell, I want to talk about how we're able to find out the IP address of the Raspberry Pi. So again, this is assuming that we don't have a keyboard or a mouse hooked up to the Raspberry Pi. But just to make life easy, let's say you guys did and you want to skip the next two steps and the majority of this video, just go to the terminal of your Pi and click ifconfig and look at the IP address that is on the iNet of your Pi. When you type in ifconfig on your Raspberry Pi, it's only going to list a couple of interfaces depending on your setup, like if you've hooked one up or something like that. But anyways, it'll just be the IP address that's present here. But like I said, we're assuming that we don't have a keyboard or a mouse. So there's two options. The first one is a lot easier than the second one, so I'll start with that one. What you can do is you can look up on Google depending on your internet provider company, they have different websites that host like information for your router. So I looked up mine and it happens to be 192.168.1.254. And once it loads, it's going to give me a lot of information about my router, and I can look at all the settings on it through this web page, and it's kind of useful. And so for instance, I would just look at the device that I want information about. So let's say I needed information about the Apple TV. I wanted to find the IP address of it. Well, I come over here and it tells me the IP address right there. So I would just get this IP and then create a connection with SSH using this ID. However, let's assume that I can't do that. I don't know that web page. So what we can do now is something known as port scanning. And in order to do this, I'm going to open up a virtual machine, and on this virtual machine I have installed on it Kali Linux, which comes with a bunch of useful tools in order to practice network penetration. So in Kali, I'll initialize a port scan, which means that I want to scan for open ports on devices on a network. Meaning, like, for instance, I'll go back here and do ifconfig. And we saw that my IP address on this computer right here is 192.168.1.66. It's in this specific subnet right here, meaning that the prefix for all of the IP addresses on this network are going to have this fixed value of 192.168.1, and the only alternating variable will be this number right here. It can be between the range of 0 and 255. So there exists 256 possible IP addresses that are on this network. So knowing that, I won't have to scan that many devices. I only have to scan for 256. So I can go ahead and do that by typing right here. We'll use a utility or an application called Nmap. It's pretty popular. And then we'll type in the IP addresses that I want to scan. So like I said, we're doing a range. So I would specify that by typing in a dash. So I'll start at 0 and then I'll end at 255. And before I execute it, I don't want to scan for every port because computers have 55,000 ports or something like that. You know, it's up there, 55,000 something ports. and I don't need to scan for all of these ports. I think everybody and their mom knows that port 80 is a very popular port, so I'll just pass in -P stating that I'm going to scan for a specific port. And which port is that? Well, it's port 80. So let's scan for that. I'll push enter. Also, by default, Nmap will only scan, I think, the first 10,000 ports. So if I hadn't put in that -P like I did here as an argument, then it wouldn't have scanned for all 55,000 ports, but instead I think it would have scanned for something like 10,000 ports. But I don't want to even, I only need this one port, and we can finish in a fraction of the amount of time. So now I see all of the current devices that are on the network, and oh, hey, what do you know, Raspberry Pi Foundation right here. So what this tells me is that the IP address for this Raspberry Pi is 192.168.1.113. So now I can close out Kali. We're done with that. So now we can actually create this connection to the Raspberry Pi. And this is probably the easiest part of the whole video. And the way we do this is simply by typing in SSH, again creating a secure connection to some device across the network. Before we do this command, let me tell you about the history of SSH. Before SSH existed, there was something known as Telnet, which does essentially the same thing. It allows us to connect to a device across a network. However, the issue with that was that the information being transferred was relatively insecure, and if somebody was trying to sniff out the packets, they would be able to see what you guys are passing to each other, like for instance passwords, data, and stuff like that. So SSH came along and created a secure shell or secure connection which is encrypted. So instead of someone being able to blatantly see all the information that you guys are passing to each other, it's going to be jumbled up and encrypted, and you won't be able to read what's on that data unless you have the key to the encryption. So for now, we'll just think of this as really good. So SSH, and then the name of my Pi by default will just be Pi, and then I'll pass in that IP address that we just scanned for. So I'll paste it, and just like that, let me do sudo to run this as a super user, and then now it's going to ask me for the password on my computer as sudo will after X amount of minutes. And it's saying, okay, look, we can't verify the authenticity of this device. Is that okay? For now, I'll click yes. And then it's going to ask me to input the password for the Raspberry Pi. And by default, it's going to be Raspberry. So I'll type in Raspberry, Raspberry. And there, just like that, I'm actually on my Raspberry Pi now. If I do ls, this is essentially being on the terminal for the Raspberry Pi, except I'm on my Mac right now. So how cool is that, guys?